Welcome to Housing for Huntsvillians, the podcast, a podcast about one couple's quest to eliminate homelessness in Huntsville by August 2026.
Thank you for tuning in to Housing for Huntsvillians. What do we got going today?
Okay, our audio-only people will not be able to appreciate this, but put some dry shampoo in my hair, put makeup on, wear a cute top, because I'm making up for the fact that I don't really know what I'm talking about today. I mean, not that I ever do, but this project is a balance, right? Like, part of the reason I'm doing this is to learn about housing and homelessness and governance and urbanism in cities, and to share what I'm learning with my beautiful partner and our tens of listeners. And
which we very much appreciate.
Thank you so much. So anyway, the story is I saw a news article on AL.com where our city council member, John Meredith, District 5 represent, it was saying that District 5 desperately needs more affordable housing, which is true. As far as I can tell, every district in Huntsville desperately needs more affordable housing, and suggested that the city buy land and offer it to housing developers at a discount to incentivize them to build affordable housing. And so I was thinking about that, and I was like, that just doesn't seem like a very efficient way to do something that absolutely needs to be done. We need more affordable housing, but, is that the best way to go about it? So I started looking into so when people talk about affordable housing, that's usually code for subsidized housing. Now, when I say it, I mean literally housing low-income families can afford. But just so people who aren't neck deep in housing policy are aware, that's how the term is often used. So, okay, I started to look into, what are some of the procedures and policies around subsidized housing. And so I wanted to go through some of the reasons that I found that subsidizing housing is just wildly inefficient, and why, instead of subsidizing housing, it makes way more sense to just get the regulations that make all housing more expensive than it needs to be out of the way, and give the families who are still not going to be able to afford housing without help, even when all housing is less expensive and developers are able to profitably build housing that most families can afford. There'll still be some families that can't afford it, and why we should just give those families cash rather than having the government get into the business of building and maintaining housing. So anyway, one of the problems with subsidized housing is that it tends to concentrate poverty. So when you have naturally affordable housing, you have a mix of incomes naturally, because some people will live there because that's all they can afford. Other people will live there because they don't want to spend more money on housing. They'd rather spend their money on vacations or save it. I mean, every place I lived in San Francisco was less than 30% of my income, even though most people spend more than 30% of their income on housing. Yeah. I didn't, because I didn't want to. I was always afraid, if I lose my job or an unexpected expense comes, like that was the idea of spending, 50% of my income on rent was just very stressful to me. And, the idea of living in a not very nice place was okay. So that's the choice I made. So anyway, when you have a market, you have a natural mix of incomes. When you have subsidized housing, there's usually an income cap. You're literally not allowed to live there if your income exceeds a certain amount. And when your income, if you happen to earn more income, then you can, lose the subsidies. That's its own problem. Anyway, so and so some people will say, well, then why don't we just build mixed income development? So you have a mix of market rate and subsidized housing. Well, I don't want to like skip ahead, but the TLDR for a lot of why this is not an efficient way to provide housing using subsidies is because the financing is extremely complicated, and financing is even more complicated for mixed market rate and market rate and subsidized housing. So that makes that difficult, and is one of the reasons those projects are not very common. Okay, so the concentrated poverty part.
I never thought about them concentrating poverty, but yeah, it makes sense. If you just give people money, they get to just mix in with, you're not. That makes sense, but I never thought of it, I guess.
Yeah. No, it's a lot of this is not intuitive. And I think the reason I want to talk about it is because I think a lot of the people who are pushing for subsidized housing, haven't thought through, well, what are the pros and cons and alternatives? It's like, well, people need housing and the government exists to give people things they need. So why doesn't the government give people housing?
And I think that's the theme that I've seen, like, talking to you about housing stuff is like, there are a lot of really good ideas that if you don't realize they're tying into a much larger system, there are a lot of ideas that sound really good, like, on their, like, just on face value, but then, like, you start looking into the ripples it causes elsewhere and, like, how everything is interconnected around housing and how, like, if you change one thing, it can have dire consequences. So yeah, no, this is awesome that you're going through this.
Thank you. I mean, this is why you need, every jurisdiction needs dedicated autists who are systems thinkers who will go through and say, okay, this policy, ameliorates this problem, but this problem operates in a system. And how does this solution impact the system as a whole? What are the ripple effects? What are the unintended consequences of this policy? And that's where a lot of times the people who are implementing policy and advocating for policy, they don't think ahead or they don't think in a systems manner. And that's why we have so many problems.
Yeah.
And, I understand that political realities are what they are and that maybe you make those choices even though they have, unintended. Sometimes we choose the worst policy because that's the policy we can get past. And I understand that. But at least let's have the conversation about, in a world where we could get anything passed, this is what the best policy would be based on the evidence we have available to us. But yeah, like a great example of what you're talking about, and I think this is what you're referring to, is last night at the dinner table, we were just chatting, and I was, raging about politics, and it was a normal night for us.
It was awesome. I liked it.
And I said, someone proposed decreasing, sorry, I believe, I may be misunderstanding the proposal, but raising the income cap for people who are exempt from property taxes in Alabama.
Yeah, essentially he said it was something akin to Prop 13 out of California. Right.
So the idea is, especially in growing cities, but really across Alabama, property values are rising because people are moving to Alabama and we're not building as many homes as new people are moving in. So you have increased demand, static, if not decreasing supply, because, homes go out of commission every year. Prices rise. Well, when values rise, property taxes rise because property taxes are based on the value of your home. So you have people who are on fixed incomes. These are like retirees, people on Social Security, people who are on disability or Medicaid. Then you just have people who, the bottom half of earners haven't seen significant wage increases since the 70s. That's debated, but, there's a certain portion of the population for whom that's true, at least. Anyway, and we know across the board, at least for the bottom half of earners and really for the average American, home prices are, the cost of shelter is increasing far faster than wages. So, this creates a burden for these families. And so an obvious solution is to give low-income families a break. But I was saying in California, the same thing happened in the 80s, I want to say, maybe late 70s. But I think it started in the late 70s. And I think what happened was a bunch of people moved to California and they didn't build a bunch of new houses for them, and housing prices shot up and a lot of people had trouble paying their property taxes. And so the Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association passed Prop 13, which basically cemented in place the property tax burden for current homeowners at that level of whatever year it passed. And I think it could increase like 1% a year, or basically like kept it steady until you sold your house. And then you had to buy a house with the current property tax rate. So yeah, it was a subsidy, at least in the short term, for current homeowners who, by the way, most of whom did not need a subsidy. But it exacerbated the overall crisis, right, by keeping people in homes that were too large for them, because they wanted to keep their property taxes low. And so part of how you solve a housing crisis is you get people in the right homes for them. But anything that keeps people in their homes, and it's problems for labor as well, maybe you could get a better job an hour away from where you live, but if your property tax increase is going to dwarf the raise, then you're not going to do it, and that's going to be bad for the economy. So there are all kinds of reasons. And the worst part of all is I forgot who did the analysis, but it seemed totally credible. California just raised its fees, fines, and other taxes. So it didn't end up being a tax cut. The tax burden for the average California family, for the average California homeowner, ended up being the same. It was just changed to create a disincentive for something we want to see, which is people buying and selling homes. So Prop 13 was a terrible idea. And so again, with this idea of like, let's raise the cap of people who are exempt from property taxes, like it sounds like a good idea, but it's going to, it doesn't solve the underlying problem. And the underlying problem is that property values are rising too fast, right? Like there's no need for property values to keep rising. If they do keep rising, the cost of housing concomitantly rises, which is not good for anyone except for homeowners who can take their equity and downsize and then take advantage of that wealth. But everyone else suffers when property values rise. So, yeah, I think a better solution, if you can't afford your property taxes, rather than saying, let's cap those property taxes and try to make the money elsewhere, build more housing near your home so that prices fall and your property tax burden falls as well. So anyway, but
that makes sense.
Yeah, and it's not as simple. I mean, it's more simple in a lot of ways, but it's less simple in other ways. And I think people in this country, because so many people, I mean, for most white middle-class families, the home equity is their number one source of safe. Could y'all not? For 10 minutes.
Yeah, our cats are terrors. Terrors is what our cats are.
What was I saying?
Talking about God.
Anyway.
This is getting cut.
Property taxes. Oh, okay. So yeah, so for most middle class white families, and I want to say like most families, the number one source of personal wealth and savings and investment is home equity. So people are very, very concerned with their property values. And I understand that from an individual perspective. But at the same time, a lot of people are cut out of that avenue for wealth. And there are some avenues for wealth that can be positive sum and can be broadly shared. You know, when the stock market goes up, for example, everyone who's participating benefits. And there are all kinds of problems with the stock market and investor capital and capitalism and yada yada. But I'm just saying, comparatively speaking, it's a much more positive sum, broadly shared way to generate wealth than property values, because every dollar that a homeowner gets in equity is taken from someone who hasn't gotten on the property ladder yet. It's taken from generally lower income, younger people and given to generally older, higher income people. It's taken from generally non-white people and given to overwhelmingly white people. Like it's a transfer. It's a negative sum, like a zero sum. I don't know. It's a transfer of wealth, generally speaking, upwards. And homes cannot be vehicles of wealth creation and broadly affordable at the same time. That is not possible. You cannot do that. So the whole concept of like property values must go up, like I understand it on an individual basis, but on a society-wide basis, it's a horrible way to do things. And it's something we need to move away from as soon as freaking possible.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's nice that your land's like super valuable, but like...
At what cost?
Yeah. What cost? Like you're going to have rampant like homelessness around you. Like people aren't going, it's all the things that you described.
It's racial inequality, economic inequality, racial and economic segregation, poor access to education, unequal access to education and opportunity, long commutes, sprawl, which is terrible for the environment, lower overall economic growth, less economic mobility. Like all these things are created or exacerbated by a system in which most families make most of their wealth from property values increasing. So don't like it. Anyway, to the topic at hand. So the issue is, one of the main issues so there are two ways you can create affordable housing. You can subsidize it, or you can get government out of the way so developers develop it on their own. Like developers are already incentivized to create affordable housing. They create unaffordable housing right now because they're not allowed to create all the housing that they want to create. So if you're only allowed to create a certain amount of housing, you're going to create the most profitable housing first. But in a market where developers can create whatever they can sell, which is the environment I want to create, then they're gonna eventually sell to everybody, and that's going to include low-income people, because even low-income people can afford housing that we can make more cheaply than developers can make more cheaply than they can sell. So, and again, a lot of the reason that they're not able to make that housing right now is a lot of it's illegal. Land is artificially expensive because there's so little of it that's legal to develop multifamily on.
Oh, yeah.
And building codes and regulations prohibit naturally affordable building types such as mobile homes, SROs, ADUs, modular housing, these kinds of things. So anyway, naturally affordable, subsidized. Part of the problem with subsidized is that in order to get subsidized housing built, you have to have financing. So the developer needs money to buy the land and pay the workers and buy the materials. Like, obviously, developing housing costs money. A for-profit developer can go to investors who just want to see a return on their investment and say, hey, we've done all this research. This is what we think the return on investment is going to be. Do you want to sign on? And it usually takes a few investors. The terms are pretty straightforward, and they go from there. It's pretty simple. Subsidized housing is completely different. So by definition, subsidized housing can't be as profitable as for-profit housing. So this, first of all, limits the number of financiers that subsidized housing developers can work with, because a lot fewer organizations are lending to definitionally less profitable projects.
Yeah, like that, it kind of goes against the whole, like, that's not what you invest in. Like, if you have other more profitable options on the table.
Right. So things that will impact the upfront costs of subsidized housing would be like, some of these lenders and financiers will, a lot of times they're more risk averse, so they'll require higher reserve levels than for-profit lenders. And a lot of times they'll be less flexible in terms of like innovative deals and development types. That might be less costly overall, but they're not, allowed by these lenders. So a lot of this information is from a report called Bending the Cost Curve: Solutions to Expand the Supply of Affordable Rentals. Really good paper. Highly recommend you check it out if you're curious about any of this. So anyway, the people who finance projects that are subsidized are often public, nonprofit, and mission-driven organizations. And these organizations will have motivation beyond profits. So subsidized developers are having to balance, like, okay, what does the market need versus what do these organizations need as well? So again, like, not only do a lot of jurisdictions, building codes prohibit and zoning codes prohibit innovative building types or construction methods, but often these financiers will also refuse to fund those projects, which increases the cost of subsidized housing above what it costs to build market rate housing. So that will increase the per unit development cost of a subsidized project. And because there are fewer lenders to work with, that means that these lenders have more power over the developers when bargaining. So if they have terms such as you can't develop modular homes, then the subsidized housing developer has less bargaining power to negotiate what they would like to develop.
And this all just sounds like why would you go this route if you could just build more expensive housing that's without having to deal with any of these hassles?
And why would we as a city go the route of subsidizing housing when we could just legalize naturally affordable housing? Because first of all, it's all going to be more expensive. Not only is it more expensive to build subsidized housing per unit than for-profit housing and more complicated, but it's all more expensive than it needs to be. So under the current scheme, let's say the government, the Huntsville City put aside, $1 million to subsidize housing. Well, under the current scheme, we would get, X number of units. But if we legalize naturally affordable housing throughout Huntsville, we would get, 5 times that many units for the same price. So even if you are absolutely dedicated to the concept of subsidized housing for whatever reason, you should still support legalizing naturally affordable housing throughout the city because you'll get more subsidized housing for the same dollar.
But again, I think it goes, well, I don't know about on the policymaking level, but I think a lot of people just don't think about the underlying systems at play, like you were saying earlier.
Listen, other people don't spend their time reading bending the cost curve, solutions to expand the supply of affordable rentals. And I don't blame them. You shouldn't do that. But I did it. And now you're going to listen to me talk about it.
No, but I think that's why like hearing this is so useful is like, yeah, a lot of people just aren't exposed or have a reason to be exposed to the information that you've been. And yeah, it's good that you're going through this.
And I don't know, I don't think I'm going to get through all of this because it's quite boring. And I feel like I've made my point already, but we're just going to do a little bit more. So part of the reason that another reason financing subsidized housing is more expensive and a pain in the butt is that subsidized housing developers often need to assemble multiple layers of funding for each development. So because there are fewer options and because each option will have less money, then they have to work with multiple funding sources. So for example, some public funding sources mandate or provide incentives for obtaining additional or matching sources of funding. So whereas a for-profit can just work with one or two lenders, maybe they have to get three, and then one of them requires them to find a match. So then they've got to get four. So then you have to, even if the requirements aren't onerous, simply navigating all of these organizations' requirements takes a lot of time and money.
Again, why would you do that if you could just build inexpensive or just build?
Okay, so this layering of financing creates additional paperwork, fees, due diligence expenses, specialized consultants, and duplicative professionals, so attorneys, accountants, etc. Again, adding to the cost of every unit of subsidized housing. And this is another problem, is that because there are more developers than sources of funding, there's intense competition among developers. And because these processes are so complicated and because these lenders don't like risk, then they tend to go with larger, more established subsidized housing developers, which means there's less innovation in the space because the new guys often don't get a chance. And so the old guys get it, and older, more established companies tend to be less innovative. So that's another thing that adds to the cost and complexity of subsidized housing. Then, because of all this bull, subsidized housing deals take longer to assemble than for-profit deals, which increases both soft costs and landholding costs. So not only does this mean that usually developers are having to sit on and pay for the land that they're wanting to develop and make mortgage payments on that land while they navigate and try to get this financing together, but the longer it goes, the more likely it is developers will have to rework their financing and project details, which again costs time and money. The due diligence that we talked about earlier, often subsidized housing developers will have to do it for each funding source. So that's appraisals, reviews, inspections separately for each source of funding. Then, due to all these things and more, a lot of times these projects will have to be done in phases, which means, generally speaking, and so unless the housing developer can buy the land in phases, they have to buy all of the land, pay for all of the land, but only develop part of it at a time, which is, again, adds to the cost and complexity.
It's like on every level, there's something to make it more and more inefficient.
We're only in financing.
Jesus.
Yeah. Also, most entities who finance subsidized housing do it on a per project basis, which means subsidized housing developers have to identify the properties and begin scoping out a deal before they can begin to find funding, which increases delays and costs. For-profit developers have entity or portfolio level capital that they can quickly and strategically deploy when opportunities arise. So that's the financing aspect. I am not pretending that's a comprehensive overview of the challenges of financing subsidized housing projects, but That's what was in Bending the Cost Curve, and or at least what stuck out to me. There's also multi-jurisdictional issues, but I don't think that that's going to be a problem in Huntsville. So I didn't get into it, but in case it is, be aware. There's also multi-jurisdictional issues. There are also.
You do have some things like Madison County's health department controls something about lot sizes. I don't. It's like the Madison County controls some of the stuff, like some of the requirements for Huntsville development, but I don't know how extensive that goes.
So then the Bending the Cost Curve says far too often developers, as in subsidized housing developers, must seek a complex series of approvals or obtain waivers to bring a development to fruition. This process alone can reduce costs through delays to the development timeline, as well as additional uncertainty and risk, which, in addition to regulatory barriers, also increase costs. So then we have the requirements. So again, these funding sources are usually mission-driven or public or nonprofit. They have incentive. They have things they're trying to accomplish other than profit, which means they're going to put requirements on these housing developers, subsidized housing developers, which again add to the cost and complexity of each unit, of each project, which then becomes the cost of each unit. So a lot of times these entities will require developers to add a variety of amenities and services for the eventual residents of these development projects. Obviously, this adds to the cost. There are also rehabilitation minimums. So a lot of times these funders won't want to see the units go into disrepair, which is reasonable. But again, dictating rehabilitation adds to the cost and complexity of these projects. A lot of times, subsidized housing developers are encouraged, if not required, to solicit community input, which is a time-consuming and sometimes expensive process itself. But then in addition, especially if community members are empowered to block projects, will result in the community members requiring certain things of the developers that will add to the cost and complexity of their projects. And then a report underwritten by the J.P. Morgan Chase Foundation. This one is about, and this is actually what, John Meredith is proposing, which is using public land to build housing. The report warns cities to avoid cross-agency overlap and bureaucratic inefficiencies. So yeah, then there's a whole, and this is probably its own episode on the low-income housing tax credit and how that funding is assigned and the various reasons that the way the program works inherently increases the cost of housing. But we might save that for another episode. Governments usually hold subsidized housing developers to higher standards than for-profit housing developers for environmental remediation. Again, adds to the cost. So building codes obviously add to the cost of housing, but sometimes they're especially strenuous for subsidized housing. And then there are federal, state, and local rules that limit who can be hired for these projects. So, for example, a lot of jurisdictions will have approved vendor lists, which will are meant to make sure that nobody's working with low quality, untrustworthy vendors, but ends up increasing the cost of the vendors by decreasing competition. Sometimes jurisdictions will require subsidized housing developers to use public open bidding processes when hiring subcontractors, which can delay or prevent the value engineering process. Sometimes jurisdictions will use rules for the development process to meet other social goals. So, for example, increasing diversity among public contractors. So this can look like preferences or requirements to hire local contractors, minority and women-owned businesses, hiring preferences for low-income workers, and set-asides for nonprofit entities. And then requirements such as Davis-Bacon prevailing wage scales raise construction labor costs for subsidized housing. And then last, we have parking minimums, which I thought this was interesting. Parking minimums, so this is from Bending the Cost Curve. Parking minimums were the most noted barrier over the course of our research. So when they talked to subsidized housing developers, the most noted barrier to building was parking minimums. Parking minimums can add, in San Francisco, $25,000 to $50,000 in construction costs for new housing.
I never would have thought that.
Yeah, I mean, land is very expensive. Yeah. Obviously, parking minimums are not going to impact costs that much here, but they still certainly add to the cost to development. And again, like a for-profit developer without legal parking minimums is going to build the amount of parking that the market demands. There's really no need and no benefit to any kind of like legal or other pressure on developers to build more parking. So that's the overview. That's the reason why, some of the reasons, again, we've not even gotten into low-income housing tax credit situation, but just based on some of the issues with, and we haven't really gotten to the public land issue either, but just like generally speaking, when it comes to developing housing, subsidizing housing is a very inefficient, wasteful, inefficient and wasteful way to do things. It makes way more sense to make all housing more affordable and then to just give families cash. It doesn't have any of the bureaucratic rigmarole. It doesn't have any of the weird incentive structures. It doesn't have any of the bureaucratic nonsense of getting into trying to have government and nonprofits, tell developers how to develop housing. Like, that's not necessary or useful. So anyway, that's pretty much what I had to say today.
Well, thank you for sharing that with us, because I don't think a lot of people think or really even see the larger system at play. So like a lot of these things sound, like I said, really good on the surface, but like when you really do a deep dive into like the things behind like subsidized housing in this case, and like why basically there's no incentive under the current system here, at least, for developers to really undertake it because it's inefficient and is going to be a nightmare for them to navigate, it makes a lot more sense. So thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for listening.
See you guys next week.